In the heart of a storm-swept mountain wilderness, a severely injured ranger lay unconscious at the base of a cliff, completely alone, with no one knowing his location. But then, the unthinkable happened. A band of wild Mustangs appeared. Instead of fleeing, they surrounded him. And what they did next not only baffled scientists, it saved a man's life. Late August in the windswept Bassin Plateau was harsh and cold, like the sigh of a desert stirring from sleep. Jagged red rocks rose from the earth like the remnants of an ancient fury. The scent of brittle sagebrush, sun-baked soil, and the whispering wind sliding through narrow canyons formed a wild symphony only understood by those who had lived within it. Riley Grant adjusted the strap of his camera, the heel of his boot sinking slightly into the uneven terrain. Beneath his sun-faded olive felt hat, his tanned face wore the look of exhaustion, but also determination. Strapped to his side were a radio, a canteen, and a semi-automatic sidearm, standard gear for a federal ranger with criminal investigation authority under the National Forest Service. 8 years in the field. Before that, 5 as a military police officer at Fort Carson, Colorado. Enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. And this time, Riley had chosen silence. He hadn't radioed into the office back in Basin Hollow, where he was supposed to check in for his scheduled patrol. Instead, he had driven his Polaris alone up the rugged Larkspur Trail, heading toward a remote stretch of land he believed, or at least hoped, was still visited by the wild Mustang herd. Not for duty, but for a name. Thunderjaw, a silver-dappled stallion rumored by ranchers to be the ringleader of a gang of fence breakers and grass thieves. But to Riley, he was something else. An open question. A fragment of memory that had never been given a name. The midday wind swept through the valley, brushing dust off the high cliffs. Riley parked his vehicle near a weather-beaten juniper and continued on foot, following the old trail along the cliff's edge. Below lay a small ravine, the only spot with a year-round water source in miles, and judging by the fresh hoofprints embedded in the dry earth, the Mustangs had passed through just days before. He stepped onto a natural ledge jutting from the cliffside. From there, the basin below opened wide before him. And just as his gut had told him, it was there, the herd. Nearly 15 strong, moving leisurely toward the stream. Riley's heart slowed, not out of fear, but in reverence. The beauty of the scene made him want to drop to his knees. Thunderjaw stood apart, commanding and vigilant, his silver mane shimmering in the sunlight like smoke from a vanishing dream. No camera, no report, no academic symposium could capture what Riley was seeing. He knelt, lifting his camera carefully. The wind picked up a notch. He adjusted the lens, found his focus, then shifted half a step to the right for a full-frame shot of the herd. Crack. A soft, subtle sound, one only a seasoned ranger would recognize. But Riley heard it, and he understood. The rock beneath him, the very ledge he stood on, was merely a brittle shell over a larger hollow. And then, in a flash, the ground gave way. Riley barely had time to drop the camera and lunge for the edge, but his fingers missed. His body plunged into open space, crashing against sharp rocks during a long, bone-jarring slide nearly 30 feet down the slope. Flesh scraped stone, wind screamed past his ears, and dust blinded his eyes and clogged his chest. He tried to curl into a roll, instinct from old training, but it wasn't enough. A searing blow to his left hip cracked something deep inside. His back slammed into a jagged outcrop, splitting the skin at the base of his skull. The last thing Riley saw before blacking out was a smear of sky. Above him, the clouds began to churn. The wind shifted, and down in the basin, the Mustangs lifted their heads, every one of them. Ears pricked, eyes turned toward the echo from the cliffside. Thunderjaw stamped a single hoof, his low whinny rumbling like distant thunder. His silver eyes flickered with uncertainty. A man had vanished from their world. A man had fallen from the silence, and now the wind paused, as if waiting on a decision from the wild. Desert nights aren't quiet like city folks imagine. They don't hush, they hum. Damp, deep, and ancient, like something that could swallow a soul whole if it caught them off guard. Riley Grant lay twisted on a slope of shattered rock, his body contorted in a way no body should be. The northern wind was beginning to sweep in, carrying a strange chill that clashed violently with the afternoon's blistering heat. Blood had dried thick around his lips, and his breath came out in weak, wheezing gasps. Half-conscious, Riley no longer knew where he was. Images flickered in and out, blending the sound of howling wind with echoes from far away. Flashes of red lights, a roaring flood, voices yelling, and then Dean. "Grant, fall back, I told you don't." Dean's voice rose from the depths like a ghost. Riley turned, and there he was. Himself at 26, soaked and shivering on the banks of a Colorado training river, watching helplessly as Dean was swept away trying to pull him free after a landslide. He remembered the outstretched hand, the smile Dean gave just before the river took him. "Next time, live for both of us." Riley snapped awake. A stabbing pain ripped through his left hip, making him grunt aloud. The last sliver of daylight had faded. The sky turned heavy with the weight of a coming storm, dark clouds crawling in from the southeast. With trembling fingers, Riley reached for the radio clipped to his belt. But it was shattered, guts exposed like broken bones under flickering light. Hope drained out of him like water from a cracked cup. His body shook uncontrollably. Blood continued to drip from his head wound. And then, just as he hovered on the edge of passing out, he heard it. Hoofbeats. At first distant, soft thuds like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. Then closer. Clearer. Through the dust lifted by the rising wind, a shape emerged. The Mustangs. They stood at the horizon, silent as a dream. No frantic snorts. No startled retreat. Nothing like the wild reaction feral horses usually show around the scent of humans. Instead, they stood in a crescent formation, still deliberate, facing the basin where Riley lay broken. 10 sets of eyes glinted under the crescent moon, heads high, ears sharp. They didn't run. Riley's chest tightened. He didn't know if he was hallucinating from blood loss or fever, but what he saw was real. At the center of the herd stood a chestnut mare, with a lightning bolt blaze running down her face. She was lean, rugged, alert, smart eyes. He'd later call her Sable. But now she was simply a creature approaching him, closer than any wild horse had ever dared. Sable moved forward slowly, each step a rhythmic beat on the rock. Riley held his breath, lips cracked and throat raw with thirst and blood. He expected her to bolt like so many before, but she didn't. She lowered her head. Warm breath washed over his face. A cloud of steam rose from her nostrils into the cold night air. She sniffed him. No fear, no aggression. She stood there for a few long seconds, evaluating. Then, without warning, she turned and trotted away, to a shallow dip in the ground near the stream. Riley watched, eyes blurring, unsure whether he was witnessing madness or mercy. Sable dipped her muzzle into a pool of water. Then she turned back, drops glistening on her lips and chin. She stopped over Riley again and shook her head lightly. A few cool drops spattered his cheek, his lips. He opened his mouth, pure reflex, and his tongue caught the first wet sweetness he'd tasted since the fall. It was real. Cold, fresh water, earthy, life-giving. Riley choked back a gasp. His hands trembled. He tried to reach, but couldn't move. "You're helping me?" Of course she didn't answer, but she turned again, returned to the puddle, and repeated the process, again and again, bringing water to him, drop by drop, as if she understood. And then, from behind him, another shadow emerged. Massive, commanding, dappled gray and white, Thunderjaw, unmistakable. The stallion stood 10 feet away, motionless as a living monument. He didn't neigh, didn't stomp, but his eyes, cold, glowing, locked onto Riley with the weight of a decision being made. Then suddenly, he stepped forward, one step, then another, and turned his body sideways, placing himself between Riley and the rising northwestern wind. The gusts grew stronger. Thunderclouds surged from Lost Ridge, the scent of ozone thick in the air. The herd bunched together but did not leave. Riley lay trembling, not from pain anymore but from something breaking open inside him. A belief, an old stubborn truth that the wild had no place for compassion. And in that fragile, bleeding moment, he thought, if Dean could see this, he'd laugh. He always said nature was merciless. Maybe he was wrong. And across the gusting winds, Thunderjaw still stood, unshaken, like the last pillar of something Riley had never dared to name. Storms don't always arrive with fury. Sometimes they creep in, silent, patient, like a predator stalking its prey through dry brush, waiting for that final moment when its target collapses. On the exposed slope of the lower windswept basin, Riley Grant lay half-conscious, his body unmoving. The pain in his hip had dulled into a rhythmic, pulsing drumbeat inside his skull, a deep, ghostly thump that marked time and suffering. The wind had shifted, It carried with it an Arctic chill. Above, clouds thickened like a massive dome pressing down on the earth and on the will of anyone still alive beneath it. The first thunderclap didn't reach Riley through sound. It came through the ground. A vibration. Subtle, but unmistakable. As if the land itself were shaking its head at a human still clinging to life in a place it had no business surviving. He opened his eyes. Everything was blurry, but still the first thing he saw was Thunderjaw, standing motionless, ears alert, spine braced against the wind. Nearby, Sable, the chestnut mare, stood beside a shallow dip in the rock. The rest of the Mustangs formed a wide crescent around them, the shape of protection or watchfulness. And in the middle of it all lay Riley, cold, broken, and barely breathing. A gust of wind slammed through the basin, sending grit flying. Riley shivered violently. He knew what this meant. His training, years in the wild, told him the temperature was plunging. And if rain came, if he got wet without any insulation, hypothermia would finish what the fall had started. It wasn't the shattered hip or cracked skull that would kill him. It was the cold, silent, creeping cold that seeped in cell by cell, heartbeat by heartbeat. He reached down toward his belt, fingers shaking, and felt it. His emergency rescue whistle. Heavy-duty, high-decibel, could carry nearly a mile if there wasn't wind, but his hand, it was numb, barely working. The whistle slipped from his grip, rolled just out of reach, 15 inches away. So close, too far. A cry of frustration caught in his throat. His breath hitched, eyes welled with tears that couldn't fall. The wind howled. His heart stuttered. And then, a soft clatter of hooves to his left. A small shadow moved. At first, Riley didn't register it, but as the shape approached, clumsy yet graceful, he saw it. The foal. The same young horse that had followed Sable earlier. It tilted its head. Not frightened, not wary, just curious. Riley froze, held his breath. The foal sniffed toward the whistle, its metallic glint catching what little moonlight broke through the cloud cover. Yes, that, Riley rasped. Pick it up, please. The young horse nudged it gently, rolled it once, then again, and suddenly, with a motion that was part awkward, part instinct, the foal clamped it in its soft lips, lifting it clean off the ground. Riley stopped breathing. Don't run off with it. But the foal didn't run. It stepped forward, delicately, and dropped the whistle right onto Riley's chest, within reach of his trembling fingers. His heart nearly burst. He clutched the whistle. With every ounce of strength he brought it to his lips. 1, 2, 3 short bursts. Then 3 long, then 3 short again. The universal SOS. The sound ripped through the dark, cutting the wind like a blade. The Mustangs stirred. A few flinched, but none ran. Thunderjaw let out a low, guttural noise from deep in his chest, a signal to hold ground. Riley blew again. Then again. No answer came, but he didn't stop. Every few minutes he sent another burst into the wild, a call to anyone who might still be listening. Thunder rolled. Lightning cracked the sky, so bright it turned night into day for a heartbeat. Then came the rain. Not torrential, not yet, but sharp, icy drops, each one stunned like metal. Riley knew. If hail followed, if the downpour came and soaked his clothes, he wouldn't last another hour. He was preparing himself for death. But what happened next destroyed everything he thought he knew about survival. Thunderjaw stepped forward. Quiet. Deliberate. A living statue made of muscle and resolve, moving toward the broken man. Riley couldn't move, could barely breathe. And then, Thunderjaw knelt. He lowered his massive frame to the ground beside Riley. Warm, dry, solid. A living windbreak. Then came Sable. She lay down on Riley's opposite side, her flank pressed to his. Then, one by one, the others followed. The herd formed a circle, a living shield. There were no commands, no instinct from any field guide could explain this behavior. But they stayed. The rain fell harder, wind howled, lightning scorched the sky. But Riley was warm. He nestled into the bodies of these creatures, these wild souls labeled untamable and dangerous. His whole body trembled. Not from cold now, but from something deeper, a kind of emotion that cracked him open from the inside out. Through the rain he whispered, "Dean, I'm still here, but not because of training, not because of gear, not even because I fought to survive. I'm alive because a wild horse chose not to leave me." And so, on that stormy night, every survival rule Riley had ever known was rewritten. By compassion, by instinct beyond instinct, by a choice made in the heart of the wild. At last, the storm relented. The first pale streaks of light crept over the eastern horizon, barely peeling back the weight of night. The ground was soaked, as if steeped in snowmelt, the air thick with the kind of silence that made it feel like the world had paused, holding its breath for the final exhale of a man left behind. But Riley Grant was still alive. He didn't know how. No insulation. No fire. No rescue. Just his trembling, injured body wrapped inside the warmest coat on earth. A circle of Mustangs pressed close, their bodies sheltering him like silent sentries through the night. A few had stood and shaken off the mud, clinging to their manes. But others stayed beside him, unmoved, as if the night had not yet ended. Riley's vision blurred again, whether from emotion or a reopened wound on his brow. He didn't know. The cold had constricted his blood vessels. Pain throbbed in waves through every nerve. Then, a new sound pierced the hush. The slicing rhythmic whump of rotor blades, a helicopter. His eyes flew open, not a hallucination, real. The sound grew louder, sharper, closer. Hope, thin as fishing line, pulled him back from the edge. Up above, Macy Alvarez gripped her headset tight, scanning the ridges and gullies through fogged windows. As the lead coordinator of the county search and rescue team, she had tracked the last known GPS ping from Riley's ATV before it had gone dark. The search zone spanned 10 square miles, but Macy had directed the pilot to focus on known danger spots, overhangs, steep cliffs, hidden gullies. "You're sure this was the last ping?" Macy called into her mic, her voice competing with the rotor noise. Lieutenant Ed Noland, the pilot, nodded, eyes fixed on the controls. "North of Basin Climb. Second sweep, but low clouds are killing visibility." "We're out of time," Macy said tightly. "Temps dropped below freezing last night. If he's out here without cover..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew the odds were against survival. Down below, Riley drifted between waking and fading. He couldn't see the helicopter through the low fog, but the sound, it was real. Clearer than anything in his long night. Reflex kicked in. He reached into the pocket on his side. His fingers found it. The emergency Mylar blanket, still sealed in its plastic case. The one piece of gear every ranger carried. He pulled it free. Half of it opened. The rest, matted with blood and caked mud, refused to unfold. Even that simple task was torture. And then, once again, something impossible happened. The same young foal stepped forward, not seeking the whistle this time. It moved toward the glint of silver in Riley's hand, sniffed, then gently took one corner of the reflective sheet between its teeth and pulled. Across from it, Sable stepped forward. No command, no cue. She took the opposite corner and pulled in the other direction, helping spread the sheet across the ground. The wind pinned it flat, the silver gleaming like a signal mirror beneath the rising sun. On the ridgeline, Thunderjaw had already moved. The stallion climbed the tallest nearby ledge, ears rigid, nostrils flaring. Then, he rose. Front hooves lifted into the air. He reared up, then slammed them into the ground. Once, twice. The impact sent dust and pebbles flying, echoing through the canyon like a war drum. In the helicopter, Macy lunged toward the window. "What the hell was that? Give me the binoculars." Through the scope, she saw something she could barely process. A massive silver-gray horse, standing alone on a rocky outcrop, stomping repeatedly, and beneath him, a flash of silver on the ground. "Wait, wait," Macy shouted. "Turn us around. Drop altitude. There's movement." The chopper wheeled back. A searchlight swept across the ridge, striking the Mylar blanket. Then, Macy saw it. A body. A man. Surrounded by horses? "Oh my God, it's Riley." Nolan pulled the chopper into a descent, scanning for a flat patch. They found one, a hard-packed area ringed with scrub and dust. As the helicopter touched down, Macy and medic Mike leapt out, sprinting toward the man on the ground. The Mustangs flinched. A few backed off, but none ran. Thunderjaw remained atop the ridge, watching. Macy dropped to her knees beside Riley, voice breaking. "Riley? It's Macy. Can you hear me?" Riley blinked, then smiled, weakly. "They didn't leave. They stayed. All night." Mike was already checking vitals, shining a light into Riley's eyes. "Can you hear me? Can you move your fingers? Still numb?" "Enough to know? This isn't a dream." Mike raised an eyebrow. Macy looked around and saw it too. A circle of wild horses, still standing nearby. Not running, not spooked, still there. Thunderjaw didn't move until they loaded Riley into the chopper. Only then, only when Riley looked back through the window, did the stallion finally turn, stomp once more, and walk calmly back into the hills. That moment, no one on the rescue team ever forgot. A wild herd of Mustangs didn't run, didn't kick, didn't scatter. They stayed and saved a life. The late autumn sun slanted through the tall pines, spilling gold across the worn wooden porch of Lone Pine Ranger Station. On a weathered iron-backed chair, Riley Grant sat in silence. His hands rested on his knees, his right hand lightly brushing the edge of the brace still locked around his recovering left leg. He wore an old fleece jacket, its hem covering most of his thigh, the collar pulled high to conceal the frostbite blister that had just peeled off the side of his neck. He'd been back at Lone Pine for less than 3 days after transferring from the rehab facility. And for 3 mornings straight, he'd sat right there, not to stare at the trees, not to reflect on the miracle that had happened in the mountains, but to do the only thing that made sense anymore: be still. The station radio on the stone table next to him crackled now and then, Macy Alvarez's voice chiming in hourly with updates from the field. Lost hikers, faint pings from patrol teams on the southern edge. Riley never picked up the mic. He just sat and listened, letting the world move without needing to interfere. The door creaked open behind him. A shadow stepped onto the porch, carrying a stack of folders and an old military-style leather satchel. A low southern voice followed, warm but firm. "Still not talking to anyone?" Riley didn't turn, but a faint smile tugged at the edge of his lips. "Had a good conversation with Pine Tree number 7 yesterday. It told me silence was smarter." Brent Howard set the satchel down beside the stone bench and lowered himself onto the seat next to Riley. He wore a brown leather coat, salt and pepper hair cut close, and eyes like a man who'd read 100 combat reports and remembered the first line of every one. "You look just like you did when you came home from Fort Carson," he said. "Quiet. Eyes too old. Back to the wall." "Tactical position," Riley muttered. "No. Punishment," Brent replied. "Not accusatory. Not pitiful. Just true." They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Brent opened the satchel and pulled out a few photographs. "Brought something for you. Not part of the medical report, but it's in the special file from the rescue team." Riley took the top photo. It had been taken from Mike's body cam, one of the EMTs on Macy's team. The frame was wide, high-res. Riley, limp on the ground, surrounded by a circle of at least 8 wild horses. 3 stood out in stark clarity: a chestnut mare bowing her head toward him, a foal standing beside her, and a silver-gray stallion, mane tangled like a storm cloud. "Thunderjaw," Riley whispered. Brent nodded. "You're not crazy, not delusional, not hallucinating. This is documented by 3 eyewitnesses and 2 camera sources. This behavior has never been recorded in any wild horse population in the United States." Riley turned to the next photo, a close-up of Thunderjaw's left flank. He froze. Barely visible through the regrown fur was a faint freeze brand. Brent pointed. "Mustang Initiative, Texas, 2011. Texas A&M ran a pilot program with a horse rescue nonprofit. They tried to condition wild Mustangs using only positive reinforcement. No ropes, no braking, just food, voice, and touch." "It got shut down," Riley said, memory stirring. "Deemed ineffective," Brent nodded. "Only 3 horses passed the behavioral threshold and were re-released into the wild. That one was one of them." Riley exhaled, slow and long, like shedding a heavy dust that had coated his lungs from the inside. "You want me to file a full report?" he asked quietly. Brent shook his head. "I want you to look at this," he said, handing over another folder. Inside were satellite photos, migration maps, sensor data from near Clifftree Creek. "Not just Thunderjaw," he said. "Sable, the mare, never had recorded human contact. The foal either. But their actions, they weren't random. They weren't instinct. They were social behavior, empathic mimicry." "They learned from Thunderjaw," Riley murmured, almost to himself. "If the lead doesn't run, they don't. If he protects, they protect, not because they understand, but because they trust." Brent straightened up, something flickering behind his eyes. Part caution, part hope. "We want you to lead the observation team. No contact, no callers, just distance-based monitoring and behavioral logs." Riley raised a brow. "You want research?" Brent shook his head. "No, I want to find out if compassion exists where we thought it never could. And if it does, then maybe the wild isn't as wild as we believed." Riley didn't answer right away. He looked out into the trees. A breeze drifted through the canopy. Somewhere above, a hawk cried out. Then quietly, he nodded. They didn't turn their backs on me, Brent, so I won't turn mine on them. Brent stood, clapped Riley's shoulder. Still a soldier, Grant, you've just found a different battlefield. After Brent left, Riley stayed seated. Then, slowly, he lifted his left leg. Still sore, still weak, but strong enough to stand. He gripped the railing, pushed upward, just a few steps, but every step shook something loose deep inside. Not bones, but belief. Because the worst scars, the deepest ones, aren't left on flesh. They live where we least expect them. In the places we once gave up on wonder. Summer winds along the northern rim of the windswept basin didn't carry grit like the deserts farther south. They weren't harsh, either. They were thin, cool, and just sharp enough to remind you, no matter how bright the sun blazed, this land still belonged to the wild, not to man. Riley Grant stood atop a low ridge of rock, eyes fixed on the valley below. The same valley where, 6 months ago, he thought he'd seen the last daylight of his life. His body still bore the evidence. A slight limp in his left leg, a long scar cutting across his temple, hands rougher now from countless hours of therapy, hiking, and note-taking with fingers that had once frozen to the bone. But what had changed most was his eyes. They no longer held the guarded edge of a former military policeman, nor the furrowed brow of a ranger weighed down by deforestation stats and trespassing reports. Now his gaze was quieter, deeper, like someone who had learned to listen, not with ears but with stillness. Beside him sat a light day pack. Inside, a few basic field tools, binoculars, a handheld camera, and a notebook marked Field Notes, Mustang Basin Phase 2 RG. No gun, no flashlight, no combat knife. He hadn't come to enforce. He'd come to observe. The Mustang Social Mapping Project, a collaboration between the state government and the University of Wyoming, had officially entered its second phase, focused on tracking unusual interspecies behavior in wild horses. And Riley Grant, who had survived because of those very behaviors, was now the project's lead field consultant. But no one knew that every time Riley returned to this place, he spent at least the first hour not writing, just watching. Today was no different. He sat beside a twisted juniper, unscrewed the cap on his canteen, took a sip, then poured the rest onto the ground. Onto the very spot where 6 months earlier a chestnut mare had carried water to him, drop by drop. "Thank you, Sable," he whispered. A branch rustled nearby. Then a familiar sound, the strike of hooves against stone. He stood quickly, not in fear, but in hope. From behind a dense cluster of sagebrush, Sable appeared. Same broad chest, same powerful frame. That unmistakable lightning blaze marking down her face. Her dark eyes were steady. Her ears stood tall. Her nostrils flared as if sifting familiar scents from the wind. Riley didn't move, didn't breathe deeply. He just waited. Sable took slow, careful steps, each one deliberate. At less than 10 feet, she paused. Her gaze met his, not like a human looks at an animal, but like two beings who had once shared something beyond language. Riley bowed his head. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a red apple. No tricks, no treats, just a gesture, simple, pure. He held it out in his open palm. No force, no bait, just gratitude. Sable tilted her head, then stepped forward, 3 more paces. They were now just 3 feet apart. She lowered her muzzle, brushed her nose gently against his hand, and took the apple, chewed slowly. Then, lifted her head and tapped his shoulder lightly with her nose. "I remember you?" He didn't move. Couldn't. His chest swelled, his throat burned, his eyes blurred, not from pain but from something deeper, something older. A low snort echoed across the ridge. From the pines, Thunderjaw stepped out. No introduction needed. The presence alone stopped Riley cold. The silver-gray stallion moved toward them, each step a rhythm Riley knew by heart. Sunlight caught his coat, setting it aglow. His mane drifted in the breeze like ash from a long smoldering fire. His eyes locked on Riley, not with suspicion, but with waiting. Riley bowed lower this time, arms loose at his sides. "That day, I never got to say thank you." Thunderjaw came within 3 steps, then lowered his head subtly, not as a threat, not to challenge, but like a leader acknowledging something already understood. "You don't owe me anything. I saw you, and I stayed." Riley reached into his pack, pulled out a second apple, and set it on the ground. Thunderjaw didn't rush, but eventually he stepped forward, took it, and stepped back, not turning his back, just retreating with grace. From all sides, the rest of the herd emerged, the now grown foal, now a sturdy 2-year-old with confidence in its stride. Other Mustangs Riley recognized from motion-triggered cameras. None of them ran, none of them snorted or bucked. They simply stood there. With him. Not because of food, not out of fear, not for any reason science could easily chart, but because something had been forged, in silence, in instinct, in something that defied training. Riley sat again beneath the twisted tree. He opened his notebook, and for the first time that day, he wrote, "Day 1, I am no longer an outsider." And in the breeze, carried by the rhythm of hooves on stone, was a truth only those who had brushed against death could feel in their bones. To survive is not the same as living again. But to be welcomed back by the wild, that's as close to rebirth as it gets. Summer winds along the northern rim of the windswept basin didn't carry grit like the deserts farther south. They weren't harsh either. They were thin, cool, and just sharp enough to remind you, no matter how bright the sun blazed, this land still belonged to the wild, not to man. Riley Grant stood atop a low ridge of rock, eyes fixed on the valley below. The same valley where, 6 months ago, he thought he'd seen the last daylight of his life. His body still bore the evidence, a slight limp in his left leg, a long scar cutting across his temple, hands rougher now from countless hours of therapy, hiking, and note-taking with fingers that had once frozen to the bone. But what had changed most was his eyes. They no longer held the guarded edge of a former military policeman, nor the furrowed brow of a ranger weighed down by deforestation stats and trespassing reports. Now his gaze was quieter, deeper, like someone who had learned to listen, not with ears, but with stillness. Beside him sat a light day pack. Inside, a few basic field tools, binoculars, a handheld camera, and a notebook marked Field Notes. Mustang Basin Phase 2, RG. No gun, no flashlight, no combat knife. He hadn't come to enforce, he'd come to observe. The Mustang Social Mapping Project, a collaboration between the state government and the University of Wyoming, had officially entered its second phase, focused on tracking unusual interspecies behavior in wild horses. And Riley Grant, who had survived because of those very behaviors, was now the project's lead field consultant. But no one knew that every time Riley returned to this place, he spent at least the first hour not writing, just watching. Today was no different. He sat beside a twisted juniper, unscrewed the cap on his canteen, took a sip, then poured the rest onto the ground. Onto the very spot where 6 months earlier, a chestnut mare had carried water to him, drop by drop. "Thank you, Sable," he whispered. A branch rustled nearby. Then, a familiar sound. The strike of hooves against stone. He stood quickly, not in fear, but in hope. From behind a dense cluster of sagebrush, Sable appeared. Same broad chest, same powerful frame. That unmistakable lightning blaze marking down her face. Her dark eyes were steady. Her ears stood tall. Her nostrils flared as if sifting familiar scents from the wind. Riley didn't move, didn't breathe deeply. He just waited. Sable took slow, careful steps, each one deliberate. At less than 10 feet, she paused. Her gaze met his, not like a human looks at an animal, but like two beings who had once shared something beyond language. Riley bowed his head. Then slowly he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a red apple. No tricks, no treats, just a gesture. Simple, pure. He held it out in his open palm. No force, no bait, just gratitude. Sable tilted her head, then stepped forward. 3 more paces. They were now just 3 feet apart. She lowered her muzzle, brushed her nose gently against his hand, and took the apple, chewed slowly. Then lifted her head and tapped his shoulder lightly with her nose. "I remember you." He didn't move, couldn't. His chest swelled, his throat burned, his eyes blurred, not from pain, but from something deeper, something older. A low snort echoed across the ridge. From the pines, Thunderjaw stepped out. No introduction needed. The presence alone stopped Riley cold. The silver-gray stallion moved toward them, each step a rhythm Riley knew by heart. Sunlight caught his coat, setting it aglow. His mane drifted in the breeze like ash from a long, smoldering fire. His eyes locked on Riley, not with suspicion, but with waiting. Riley bowed lower this time, arms loose at his sides. "That day, I never got to say thank you." Thunderjaw came within 3 steps, then lowered his head, subtly. Not as a threat, not to challenge, but like a leader acknowledging something already understood. "You don't owe me anything. I saw you, and I stayed." Riley reached into his pack, pulled out a second apple, and set it on the ground. Thunderjaw didn't rush, but eventually he stepped forward, took it, and stepped back. not turning his back, just retreating with grace. From all sides, the rest of the herd emerged, the now grown foal, now a sturdy 2-year-old with confidence in its stride, other Mustangs Riley recognized from motion-triggered cameras. None of them ran, none of them snorted or bucked. They simply stood there, with him. Not because of food, not out of fear, not for any reason science could easily chart, but because something had been forged, in silence, in instinct, in something that defied training. Riley sat again beneath the twisted tree. He opened his notebook, and for the first time that day he wrote, Day 1, I am no longer an outsider. And in the breeze, carried by the rhythm of hooves on stone, was a truth only those who had brushed against death could feel in their bones. To survive is not the same as living again. But to be welcomed back by the wild, that's as close to rebirth as it gets. The main hall at the National Wildlife Conference Center in Denver was nearly full. Rows of seats stretched from the stage all the way up to the balcony. Gray-haired researchers sat beside young students, animal behaviorists beside reporters, skeptics beside believers, all of them waiting. On the screen behind the podium, a single line appeared, Thunderjaw phenomenon, beyond behavior, into the wild mind. Backstage, Riley Grant stood quietly, microphone in hand, eyes scanning the seated crowd from behind the curtain. It had been over 2 years since that stormy night in the basin, since a circle of Mustangs had chosen to stay. Now he faced a new circle of academics, scientists, and data seekers. When his name was announced, the room rose to its feet with applause. He walked out slowly, his once dark hair now lightly flecked with gray. His left leg still carried a slight hitch, but his eyes shone not with triumph, but with something quieter, the conviction of a man who had witnessed the inexplicable and chosen not to deny it. Thank you all for coming, he said, voice low but steady. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to tell you what I lived. Behind him, photos filled the screen, images from trail cams, satellite captures, heat sensors, still frames of Mustangs moving through the windswept. Then, a video played. In it, a 14-year-old boy named Travis, lost during a summer camp trip, lay curled near a boulder. The camera caught Sable stepping into frame, along with another young horse. She stood guard, still and silent, for nearly 3 hours until search teams arrived. The boy had survived thanks to infrared from a scout drone and the flicker of a rescue blanket pulled from his backpack by the mouth of the foal. The audience murmured. A few gasped. Some wiped their glasses. Riley turned. Some asked me if this was training, a conditioned response, social learning within a dominant herd structure. I'll leave most of that to the scientists. He half smiled. But I can tell you this. Those horses weren't told to do anything. They chose to. A hand rose. It was Dr. Eleanor Winters, Cornell University, a renowned skeptic, the same one who had questioned every report in Riley's initial dossier. Mr. Grant, she began, I've read your final submission, but I want to hear it from you directly. Why do you believe Thunderjaw and his herd saved you? Riley paused. The room held still. Because I didn't walk into their world with dominance, he said gently. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I fell. I was broken. I didn't look like a threat. I just looked like something that needed help. He let that settle. No charts, no defense. And yet, it landed. Not in the logic, but in the gut. After the talk, Riley stepped outside. The sky was soft with late afternoon haze. Pine-scented air drifted in from the mountains to the west. Macy Alvarez joined him, steady as ever, ponytail tight, eyes sharp. But today there was something gentler in her expression. 2 years, she said quietly. Feels like last month, Riley replied. They walked in silence for a bit. Then Macy asked, That day I found you. You said, they saved me, every single one of them. Do you really believe that herd understood what you needed? Riley didn't answer right away. They passed a child pushing a toy cart shaped like a horse, laughing. Riley's eyes followed the little wheels. Then he looked at Macy. Some things aren't in textbooks, he said softly. Like what it feels like to know you weren't left behind. You can't teach that, can't measure it, but it's real. Macy nodded, a smile that said, I get it. 1 week later, Riley returned to the windswept basin. The research project was still active, now joined by 3 new teams from major universities. But Riley requested only 2 items, binoculars and a voice recorder. He didn't want to interfere, and they agreed, because if anyone had earned the herd's trust, it was him. That morning, he stood at the edge of a rocky overlook. In the valley below, the Mustangs were moving. Some had changed, some had gone. But Thunderjaw was still there. Unmistakable, majestic, silver. Sable walked beside him, and the once small foal, now grown into a strong young stallion, strode confidently just behind Thunderjaw, learning the rhythm of the wild. Riley sat down. Didn't write, didn't raise a lens. He simply whispered, "You don't belong to me, I know that. But thank you for letting me feel like I wasn't alone." Thunderjaw lifted his head. The wind caught his mane, and then, before he turned, he did something simple and astonishing. He stamped once, firm, deliberate, and led the herd into the mist. No call, no sign. But to Riley it was clear, a farewell, from the wild to the one they once saved. A breeze touched his shoulder, not cold, just enough to remind him, when you're quiet enough to listen, nature speaks back. If you believe that survival sometimes comes from the wildest souls, drop a 1 in the comments below. If you've ever felt a moment that crossed the boundary between human and nature, comment 0. And if Riley and Thunderjaw's journey made your heart pause for just a second, hit subscribe so you never miss the stories to come, where freedom, love, and life are told through the eyes of those who can never be tamed.